All right, let's dive right in. Today, we are tackling a really huge idea, something right at the heart of American history, the American promise. Now, it's a phrase we hear all the time, right? But what it actually means, well, that's been a battleground for centuries. So what is this promise?
So let's just put that question right out there. What is the American promise? Is it about getting rich? Is it about being free? Is it about equality, security? The thing is, as you're about to see, the answer has never been simple, and it has definitely never been settled.
Okay, so for some people, the promise was all about this idea of limitless expansion, a divine purpose. This concept, manifest destiny, basically said America's job was to spread its values all the way across the continent, and by force if that's what it took. It's a really powerful vision of national greatness, one that felt like it was ordained from on high.
But for a whole lot of other people, that promise rang completely hollow. This quote from the People's Party back in 1892, it paints a totally different picture. They didn't see a promise of opportunity for everyone. They saw massive injustice, a system that built up incredible fortunes for a tiny few right on the backs of the many. And right there, in that tension between these two ideas, that's where our story really begins.
So our first stop is going to be the period right after the Civil War. I mean, the promise on the table was freedom itself. But what that one single word truly meant was about to be fought over tooth and nail. Just think about it. For 4 million newly freed African Americans, the end of slavery wasn't some finish line. Not at all. It was the start of a brand new fight. The promise of freedom was made, sure, but it was going to have to be won inch by painful inch against some really fierce opposition.
And what you had was this clash of two visions that just could not coexist. On one side, you've got the white landlords who wanted to put everything back the way it was, to restore that old power structure. And on the other side, you have black freedmen who were striving for real, genuine independence. This wasn't just about jobs. They were fighting over the very definition of what it means to be free.
And out of this intense conflict, this system called sharecropping emerges. On paper, it looked like a compromise. But in reality, it often became a new kind of economic slavery. It trapped families in these endless cycles of debt, keeping that promise of true economic freedom just always out of reach for generations.
The result of this system was just staggering. I mean, look at Georgia in 1874. Black Americans made up nearly half the population, but they've been so systematically shut out of owning land that they paid only 2% of the taxes. That tells you everything. The promise of freedom was absolutely not translating into economic power.
So, in the end, you get this tragic reality. While the Civil War did end slavery, the peace that came after saw the systematic takedown of all the progress made during Reconstruction. As one observer put it so perfectly, the North won the war, but the South won the peace. That promise of equal citizenship was, for the time being, lost.
Now this pattern doesn't stop. It just changes shape as we move into the Gilded Age, an era of absolutely explosive industrial growth. Here, the promise sort of shifts from freedom to prosperity, but the fight over who gets a piece of that prosperity, well, that gets even more intense.
I mean, this was a time of mind-boggling new fortunes. You had railroads stretching across the entire continent, cities exploding upwards with skyscrapers. It was, without a doubt, an age of incredible prosperity. But you gotta ask the question, who was it for?
The Pullman strike is just a perfect snapshot of this whole conflict. So the Pullman Company slashes wages by a quarter, but refuses to lower the rent in the town it owns. Workers felt like the promise of a fair deal was just shattered. So they launched this massive strike. And what happens? The company doesn't negotiate. Nope. The federal government sends in troops who side with the company and just crush the entire movement. And the fallout from this was huge. It completely transformed the labor leader Eugene V. Debs. He basically looked at the situation and said, okay, if the government and the courts are always going to side with the big companies, then just tinkering around the edges isn't going to cut it. For him, the only way to get a real shot at the promise of prosperity was to fundamentally change the whole system. And hey, this fight for a better life wasn't just happening on the picket lines. At the same time that society was pushing this idea of the cult of domesticity, the belief that a woman's place was only in the home, women were out there organizing. They realized that to actually protect their homes and their families, they needed political power. They needed to fight for things like temperance and, most importantly, the right to vote.
All right, let's jump forward now into the mid-20th century. The American promise takes on a new form here, security. Security against the global threat of communism. But this fight against an enemy overseas would end up creating some deep, really painful conflicts right here at home.
The fear of this outside enemy just lit a fire of paranoia inside the country. And all of a sudden, the promise of security wasn't just about protecting our borders anymore. It became about policing people's thoughts, who they associated with. It was about defining who was and who wasn't a loyal American.
And this crusade got a name: McCarthyism. This was a really dark period where an accusation was basically treated as a guilty verdict. People's basic constitutional rights were just trampled on, and thousands of lives were ruined based on nothing more than suspicion. All of it done under the banner of keeping the nation safe.
And here is where you can really see how the promise of security was twisted and used as a weapon. The activist Jack Odell points out that segregationists just started pinning the communist label on anyone who was fighting for civil rights. The battle for national security became an excuse to deny the promise of equality.
It's just a deep and really troubling irony when you think about it. In the name of making the nation secure from a foreign threat, many of its own citizens were made to feel deeply insecure in their own country, targeted for their beliefs and for their fight for basic American freedoms. So, after going through these huge battles over freedom, prosperity, and security, we land on a really important idea. See, this story doesn't really have an ending, because the argument itself, that's the whole point.
This right here is the key takeaway. The American promise, it isn't some static thing. It's not a finished monument that we just admire from a distance. No, it's a loud, it's a messy, and it is a continuous argument that we are all a part of. The struggle is the story.
And you know, this is exactly how modern historians look at the past. They don't just give you one single, settled truth. What they do is show you the evidence, the primary documents, the visuals from all sides of an argument to help us understand the conflict itself.
We've seen it, right? We've seen how the struggle over what freedom means shaped the post-Civil War era, how the battle for prosperity defined the Industrial Age, and how the quest for security created brand new divisions during the Cold War. In every single era, this ongoing argument has forged the nation we live in today.
And that, of course, brings us to right now, because this argument is nowhere near over. So I'll just leave you with this question to think about. What version of the American promise are we, right now, in this moment, fighting to define for the future? Thanks for joining me.